Good day, students, and welcome to today's session that will deal with ownership. Please take note that this is merely a brief overview of the specific unit. You are still expected to master the content of this unit in your own time. Now let's have a look at what is understood with the concept of ownership. Now, ownership can be defined as the most comprehensive real right that you can have with regard to a thing. In principle, if one thinks of ownership basically means that you can do with your property as you please. However, this is partially true. This apparent freedom of ownership is restricted. It can be restricted by law, and it can be restricted by the rights of others. And in this session, we will have a look at how ownership can be restricted. So it's important to take note that ownership is not absolute. You cannot do with your property as you please. But before moving on to the limitations on ownership, it's important to draw a distinction between ownership and limited real rights. Now, we have discussed what ownership entails. Now, what is a limited real right? A limited real right is when you have a registered right to use the property which belongs to someone else. Example, A has a farm and I have a registered right to use a road over A's farm. So this example illustrates that I have a limited real right over A's farm, and A will have to tolerate me using this farm, using the road on the farm as it is registered and is a limited real right. Now, when you are the owner of a thing, you can use and enjoy the thing. You can enjoy the fruits of the thing. You can control the thing. You can consume or destroy the thing. You can alienate the thing, or you can burden the thing. You can even vindicate the thing from someone else who is in possession of your property. Now, this is a diagram that illustrates how ownership is limited. Ownership can be limited by the law. There are statutory limitations that regulates how you should use your property. For example, the Fire Controls Act, it regulates how you should operate with your weapon. And then you have specific rules and regulations in neighbor law that regulates how you are supposed to deal with your property. Then another example of a limitation on ownership is limited real rights of third parties. Remember the example that I've referred to a few moments ago, where A is the owner of the farm and I have a limited real right to that farm. That illustrates how A's ownership is restricted. And then also you have personal rights of third parties that can also impose certain limitations on how you use your property. I've inserted an example that illustrates a statutory limitation on ownership, and I will read through it quickly. An example would be where Tim decides to develop a part of his farm, Highlands, as a residential township, but his attorney informs him that it is not possible. It appears that a regional development plan in terms of a physical planning scheme provides that the area is to be utilized for agricultural purposes only. Tim approaches you for legal advice. Now, the advice to Tim would be, although Tim has the most comprehensive real right to Highlands, and in principle, he can do as he pleases, his ownership is nevertheless restricted. We are dealing here with a limitation on ownership in terms of the law, and more specifically in terms of statutory measure. Therefore, Tim will not be able to develop a township on Highlands. Now let's look at how neighbor law imposes certain limitations on ownership. Now in neighbor law, the landowner must exercise his entitlements in respect of his land reasonably. And on the other hand, your neighbor must tolerate this within reasonable bounds. Now, in neighbor law, one deals with nuisance. Now, what is nuisance? Nuisance refers to an unreasonable infringement of a neighbor's rights. And nuisance can be categorized into nuisance in the narrow sense and nuisance in the broad sense. So nuisance in the narrow sense occurs where a neighbor's right of personality or entitlement of use is infringed. For example, you have noisy neighbors that party till the wee hours of the morning, or there are specific hazardous gases produced on your neighbor's land that is hazardous and that is extremely smelly. In such a case, you as the neighbor can institute a prohibitory interdict against your neighbor, or you can even claim for delictual compensation. Nuisance in the broad sense would be where there is damage to your property as a result of certain actions of your neighbor. Once again, your remedies would be to institute a prohibitory interdict and or a claim for delictual damages. Now let's have a look at lateral and surface support. Now, the owner of land is entitled to support from his or her neighbor's land. You, as the owner of land, cannot make excavation which will result in your neighbor's land from subsiding. So there are specific rules and regulations that regulates lateral and surface support. Now, should this occur, meaning should you make an excavation on land which results in your neighbor's land from subsiding, you will be the owner responsible for the excavations will be liable for damage, even in the absence of fault. Now, there are also specific rules and regulations that deals with encroachments. In other words, where an owner encroaches on your land, for example, by building over a portion of your land accidentally. Now, in such a case, you as the owner of the land on which the encroachment has occurred can claim removal of the encroachment. You can also claim ejectment against payment of compensation for the enhancement of the property. Or the owner can claim that the encroacher should take transfer of the land encroached upon and pay compensation. See in your textbook how compensation is determined. Now, there are also specific common law rules with regard to encroachments of trees and plants. Now, trees planted close to the boundary, to the extent that branches encroach upon your land, you can either request the owner of the trees to remove the branches. If the owner refuses, you can approach the court for an order. If the roots of the tree encroaches upon your land, you may ask your neighbor to remove the roots. Please take note that there is little authority on the question on whether the neighbor may compel the owner of the plants to do so. Surface water. Now, every owner of land has to receive the natural flow of water from adjoining land. However, the upper tenement owner, meaning the tenement owner that is excuse me, that is located higher than your land, may not interfere with the natural flow of water in a manner which is prejudicial to the lower owner. Now, in the case of an urban tenement, water should be diverted to the nearest street. If that is not possible, it should be diverted onto the lower tenement, provided all reasonable precautions have been taken to avoid damages to the lower tenement. Please see Redelinghuis versus Bazzani for information about the criteria to determine when one is dealing with a rural or an urban tenement. Then with regard to party walls, what is a party wall? A party wall is built on the boundary between two pieces of land in such a way that the land on which it stands belongs partly to the one owner and partly to his neighbor. Each owner has a servitude of lateral support, and the party wall may not be demolished without consent. Both owners are liable for the maintenance of the wall unless one of the owners has abandoned his part of the wall. Owners should refrain from doing anything which could affect the stability of the wall, and with regard to the elimination of dangers, that aspect of the law is regulated by the law of delict. But what is important for you to know is that as an owner has a or eliminate dangerous situations on his property, for example, the storing of poisonous substances, keeping of an aggressive dog, your duty will always be to remove or eliminate such dangerous situations. Then lastly, remember earlier I've mentioned that ownership can also be restricted by means of the rights of other legal subjects. I've mentioned before, limited real rights can limit the owner's usage with regard to his or her property. Remember the example where I've mentioned that A is the owner of a farm and I have a registered real right to use the road on his farm. In that sense, my limited real right imposes a limitation on A's ownership. And then another example would be, remember this is not a servitude that we are dealing with in this example. S has a contract, only a contract, no limited real right with X in terms of which he may graze 100 heads of cattle on X's farm. In that case, S has a personal right, which is not as limiting as a limited real right, but this right still imposes a limitation on ownership. And this concludes today's session.